The cracks begin to show. The town of Grantsville was a quiet place, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the larger cities. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip spread like wildfire, but respect for authority was a deep-rooted tradition. And no one commanded more respect than Sheriff Lucas Crane. With his broad shoulders, intense gaze, and unwavering commitment to the law, Lucas was not just the sheriff. He was the backbone of the town, a figure of strength and integrity. For years, Lucas had served Grantsville with a fierce dedication, upholding the law and keeping the peace in a community that relied on him. He had a reputation for fairness and strength, a man who could be both stern and compassionate, depending on the situation. But as formidable as he was at work, his home life told a different story, one that only he and his wife, Sylvia, knew. Sylvia Crane was the kind of woman who turned heads. Elegant, poised, and always impeccably dressed, she was the image of sophistication. In her early 40s, she had aged gracefully, and her charm was as magnetic as ever. People in town admired her, often seeing her as the perfect complement to Lucas's ruggedness. She was actively involved in charity events, fundraisers, and social gatherings, and people looked up to her for her grace and poise. But beneath the polished surface, Sylvia harbored a growing resentment, a feeling that had taken root over the years. Lucas's commitment to his job, the late nights, the weekends on call, the emergencies that pulled him away from family dinners, they all had left her feeling alone, neglected, and unfulfilled. She had expressed her loneliness to Lucas before, hoping he'd make more time for their marriage for her. But Lucas, always pragmatic, brushed it off as part of the sacrifice that came with his position. His duty to the town came first, he'd say, without realizing the growing void he was leaving in their relationship. And it was in that void that a dark temptation began to take root. It started innocently enough. Brief conversations, polite exchanges, the kind of harmless interactions that occur every day. Andrew Evans, a young deputy new to the sheriff's department, had recently joined the force. In his late 20s, he was full of ambition and admiration for Lucas, hoping to prove himself to the seasoned sheriff. But it wasn't long before his attention drifted to Sylvia. Sylvia was used to admiration, but there was something about Andrew's youth, his energy, and the way he looked at her that reignited something in her, something that had been dormant for years. Andrew was bold, confident, and attentive, qualities that had faded in her relationship with Lucas. What began as casual, friendly exchanges soon grew into something more dangerous. It wasn't just Andrew, though. Around the same time, Sylvia found herself drawn to Jordan Price, a dispatcher at the sheriff's office. Jordan was quiet and intense, with a subtle charm that contrasted sharply with Andrew's youthful exuberance. He was a man who kept to himself, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. They crossed paths at community events, sharing quiet conversations that felt oddly intimate. Jordan's reserved nature offered Sylvia a sense of calm, a reprieve from the whirlwind of emotions Andrew stirred within her. But there was one more, a patrol officer named Malik Taylor. Malik was a bit of a mystery, a man who kept his personal life guarded, someone who preferred solitude to social gatherings. He occasionally covered shifts for Lucas's department, and though he rarely spoke, his presence was magnetic. His dark, brooding demeanor intrigued Sylvia, and their interactions were brief, filled with an electric tension that left her wanting more. Each man represented a different facet of desire that had been missing from Sylvia's life. With Andre, she felt youthful and vibrant. With Jordan, she felt understood and safe. With Malik, she experienced a dangerous thrill, a sense of unpredictability. Sylvia found herself compartmentalizing her relationships, maintaining strict boundaries to avoid suspicion. She knew the risks but was willing to take them, craving the freedom and excitement that each affair brought her. She became skilled at deception, crafting careful excuses for her absences, using a burner phone to communicate with each man, and meeting them in secluded spots where they wouldn't be seen. She was cautious, meticulous, and, for a time, successful at keeping her affairs hidden. But as Sylvia grew more entangled with each man, Lucas began to notice subtle shifts in her behavior. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always within her reach, clutched tightly even when she moved around the house. She had become distant, her gaze often drifting, her mind somewhere else even when she was with him. Lucas's instincts, honed from years on the job, sensed that something was wrong. "Everything all right, Sylvie?" He'd ask her, his tone gentle but probing. Sylvia would smile, brushing off his concerns with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Lucas, it's nothing. Just busy with the charity, you know. There's always something going on." Her responses sounded rehearsed, scripted, and though Lucas had no reason to distrust her, his instincts wouldn't let him dismiss it so easily. He began to notice her anxiety, the way she checked her phone with a sense of urgency, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes when she returned home late. He found himself watching her more closely, his suspicion growing each day. Then came the night when everything began to unravel. Lucas had just returned from a long shift, his mind weary but alert, a habit formed from years of vigilance. He found Sylvia sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, a faint smile playing on her lips as she typed a message. She didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in her conversation. When she finally looked up and saw him, she quickly tucked her phone away, her face flushed. "Who was that?" Lucas asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. Sylvia hesitated, her smile faltering. "Just one of the ladies from the charity," she replied, but there was a tremor in her voice. Lucas's gaze didn't waver. "Which one?" Sylvia forced a laugh, waving him off. "Oh, Lucas, you wouldn't know her. Just a new volunteer." But Lucas's instincts were on high alert. He didn't press further, not wanting to reveal his suspicion, but he knew something was amiss. That night, as Sylvia slept beside him, Lucas lay awake, his mind racing. He had never been one to pry, but his gut told him that there was more to his wife's recent behavior than she was letting on. The following morning, while Sylvia was out, Lucas decided to search for answers. He looked through her phone records, noting unfamiliar numbers and late-night calls. The evidence was circumstantial, but it fueled his growing distrust. He knew he needed more than vague suspicions if he was to uncover the truth. Days turned into weeks, and Lucas continued his quiet investigation, his every move calculated, his questions subtle. He started watching Andrew, Jordan, and Malik, noting their interactions with Sylvia, piecing together fragments of information that only deepened his suspicions. He could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior, a rage born from betrayal and humiliation, but he forced himself to remain composed. Then, one fateful night, Lucas made a decision. He was going to confront Sylvia, to lay all his cards on the table and demand the truth. But as he stood outside their bedroom door, his hand poised to turn the handle, he felt a pang of hesitation. His mind raced with thoughts of the years they'd spent together, the life they'd built, the respect he'd always had for her. Could it all really be a lie? Steeling himself, he opened the door and stepped inside, ready to face the truth, whatever it may be. Unraveling threads. As Sheriff Lucas Crane delved deeper into the mystery surrounding his wife, Sylvia, he found himself haunted by small, subtle details that gnawed at his mind. Lucas had always been a man of principle, a lawman who believed in justice and loyalty. His respect for the law was unbreakable, and until recently, he had believed in the strength of his marriage with the same conviction. But now, with every passing day, he sensed that his wife was hiding something dark, a secret that threatened to tear apart the foundation of his life. Lucas's investigation into Sylvia's behavior became an obsession, a fixation he couldn't ignore. He had served Grantsville for nearly 2 decades, upholding the law with an unwavering hand, yet he felt helpless in his own home. Sylvia's recent shift in behavior, her growing distance, the almost casual secrecy in her actions, it all pointed to something deeper than mere restlessness. One evening, Lucas sat alone in his dimly lit living room, his mind racing. He had obtained phone records from Sylvia's mobile carrier, a move he would have considered invasive under any other circumstance. But his instincts told him that he needed answers. As he combed through the call logs, he noted a pattern: repeated calls and messages to unfamiliar numbers, often late at night or during times he claimed to be attending charity events. There was one number that appeared more frequently than the others. He couldn't identify it immediately, but his gut told him that this was the key to understanding what was going on. Lucas copied the number down, his hand trembling slightly. This was the first tangible evidence of something wrong, and the confirmation was as painful as it was validating. In the days that followed, Lucas began his discreet surveillance of Sylvia. He noticed that she would often leave the house under the guise of meeting friends or working on community projects, but her returns were later than usual, and her demeanor was oddly serene, a calmness that bordered on unsettling. Lucas's mind, trained to recognize subtle shifts in behavior, noted how her gaze seemed distant, how she sometimes smiled to herself as if recalling a private memory. Lucas's suspicions grew, yet he maintained his usual stoic exterior. As far as Sylvia knew, her husband was as busy as ever, fully consumed by his work at the department. But in reality, Lucas was carefully piecing together fragments of a puzzle he wished he didn't have to solve. He became hyper-aware of her comings and goings, making mental notes of the time she left and the reasons she gave. His investigation was meticulous, a slow, simmering process that he hoped would lead him to the truth without prematurely shattering his life. The deputy. It wasn't long before Lucas's inquiries led him to Andrew Evans, the young, ambitious deputy who had recently joined the sheriff's department. Andrew had always been respectful towards Lucas, eager to make a good impression on his superior. But now, as Lucas observed Andrew with a sharper, more suspicious eye, he began to notice the subtle tension in Andrew's demeanor. Andrew was a confident young man, but there was something about his body language that caught Lucas's attention. The way he seemed to avoid eye contact whenever Sylvia's name was mentioned, the faint hesitation in his responses when Lucas asked him about his personal life. There was a shift in Andrew's usual bravado, a hint of discomfort that Lucas had missed before. One afternoon, Lucas decided to confront Andrew in his own way. He called Andrew into his office under the pretense of discussing a routine case, but as they talked, Lucas's questions became more personal, probing. "How are you settling in, Andrew?" Lucas asked, leaning back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. Andrew smiled, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "It's been great, Sheriff. I'm learning a lot, and I appreciate the trust you've put in me." Lucas nodded, his expression neutral. "Good to hear. I expect my deputies to uphold the highest standards, both on and off the job." Andrew shifted in his seat, sensing an unspoken tension. "Of course, Sheriff. I know that you and the people of this town expect nothing less." Lucas allowed a brief silence to hang in the air, watching as Andrew's confidence seemed to waver. Then, with a casual tone that masked the intensity of his suspicion, he added, "It's important to me that my deputies maintain the right kind of relationships in the community. Grantsville is a small town, and people talk. You understand." Andrew swallowed, nodding quickly. "Yes, Sheriff. I understand." But Lucas saw the flicker of something in Andrew's eyes, a trace of guilt, perhaps, or fear. It was enough to confirm his suspicions, though he held back from pressing further. Lucas knew that if he wanted the truth, he would have to approach this with patience. A direct accusation would only drive Andrew into a defensive corner, and he needed to keep him off balance. That night, Lucas sat in the quiet of his living room, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had spent years trusting the men and women of his department, and now to think that one of his own deputies could be involved in something so personal, so destructive, it was almost too much to bear. Yet, Lucas knew he had to keep his emotions in check. As difficult as it was, he reminded himself that he was still a sheriff, first and foremost. He needed hard evidence, something concrete that would either confirm or dispel his fears once and for all. The dispatcher. A few days later, Lucas turned his attention to Jordan Price, the dispatcher. Jordan was quiet, almost invisible within the department, rarely drawing attention to himself. He had always been reliable, doing his job without complaint, and Lucas had never thought to question his loyalty. But in light of what he had discovered about Sylvia's behavior, everyone connected to her now seemed like a potential suspect. Jordan's demeanor was different from Anders. He didn't exude the same bravado, and his interactions with Lucas were polite but distant. Lucas began watching Jordan's movements as well, noting the times he left the station, the people he spoke to, the subtle changes in his behavior. It wasn't easy. Jordan was careful, almost too careful, as if he was hiding something. One evening, Lucas waited until Jordan's shift was over before casually stopping him in the parking lot. He had no intention of confronting him directly, but he wanted to observe his reaction to a few pointed questions. "Jordan," Lucas greeted him with a nod, his voice calm but probing. "How's everything going? You're not feeling overworked, are you?" Jordan looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm good, Sheriff. No complaints." Lucas studied him, noting the faint lines of tension around his eyes. "Glad to hear it. Just make sure you're taking care of yourself. Sometimes the work can take a toll, especially when there's added pressure." Jordan's gaze flickered, just for a moment, before he responded. "Understood, Sheriff." Lucas nodded, his suspicion deepening. Jordan was too controlled, too guarded. It was as though he was carefully managing every word, every gesture. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine as he realized how much Sylvia's deception had spread, how it had entangled men he had trusted. As Lucas walked back to his car, he felt the weight of his suspicions pressing down on him. He had hoped to find some other explanation, some way to believe that his fears were unfounded. But the behavior of both Ander and Jordan only confirmed what he had dreaded all along. The patrol officer. Then there was Malik Taylor, the patrol officer who occasionally covered shifts in Lucas's jurisdiction. Malik was a reserved, aloof man, known for his solitary nature and his tendency to keep his personal life private. He was an enigma, a man of few words, but Lucas now realized that his guarded demeanor could be hiding something far more sinister. Lucas found himself watching Malik as well, scrutinizing his movements and interactions. Unlike Ander and Jordan, Malik was harder to read. His expressions were inscrutable, his actions calculated and restrained. Lucas knew that if Malik was involved with Sylvia, he would have to tread carefully. Malik was not a man to be easily rattled. One afternoon, Lucas decided to follow Malik after his shift ended, his curiosity driving him to uncover the truth. He watched from a distance as Malik left the station, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. But Lucas's instincts told him otherwise, and he trailed Malik to a secluded spot near the edge of town, a small diner where he often went after work. Inside, Malik sat alone, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Lucas observed him through the window, noting how he sat in silence, his gaze distant. Malik exuded an air of detachment, a sense of calm that bordered on unsettling. Lucas wondered if this was the calm of a man without guilt, or the practiced indifference of someone hiding a dark secret. As Lucas returned to his car that night, his mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears. He was now certain that his wife's affairs had involved at least one of these men, and perhaps all three. The thought filled him with a bitter rage, a feeling he struggled to contain. But he knew that he couldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. He needed to stay focused, to gather more evidence before he confronted Sylvia. In the quiet of his car, Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. He felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, a sense of helplessness he had never known before. But as painful as it was, he knew that he had to see this through to the end. For Lucas Crane, the truth was no longer just about betrayal. It was about justice, confrontation, and revelation. Sheriff Lucas Crane had always been a patient man. Years of service had taught him the value of waiting, of allowing things to unfold in their own time. But as the evidence mounted against Sylvia, the woman he had loved and trusted, Lucas felt his patience wearing thin. The betrayal gnawed at him like an infection, his heart swelling with a mix of anger and sorrow that left him feeling hollow. The knowledge that Sylvia's deception had drawn in not one, but three of his colleagues, men he had trusted, only made the sting sharper. He needed answers, not only for himself, but for the integrity of his office and his town. Lucas knew that this couldn't stay buried in the shadows for much longer. The situation had escalated to a point where it threatened everything he held dear: his marriage, his reputation, and his position as sheriff. Late one evening, Lucas made the decision he had been putting off for weeks. He would confront Sylvia directly, without giving her a chance to weave any more lies. He had hoped to find a way to expose her affairs quietly, to avoid the shame and embarrassment that a public scandal would bring. But now he saw no other way. He needed her to admit the truth, to face the reality of her actions. A cold revelation. That night, Lucas waited for Sylvia in the dimly lit living room, the shadows casting dark lines across his face. His mind replayed every small detail, every suspicious behavior, every piece of evidence he had gathered over the past month. He felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the exhaustion of carrying this burden alone. Finally, he heard the sound of her key in the lock. Sylvia stepped into the room, her face illuminated briefly by the light from the hallway before she closed the door. She paused, noticing Lucas sitting in the darkness, and her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. "Lucas," she said cautiously, her voice soft, "what are you doing sitting here in the dark?" He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on her as she set down her purse and took a few steps into the room. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice low and measured. "I know, Sylvia." She froze, her hand lingering on the back of the couch, her expression flickering between confusion and fear. "What do you mean, Lucas?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face, searching for a hint of remorse, a sign that she might finally tell the truth. "I know about the affairs. All of them," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an accusation that couldn't be denied. Sylvia's face drained of color, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. But she quickly masked her reaction, straightening her posture as she met his gaze, her expression hardening. Her voice was tight, defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her tone almost defiant. Lucas felt a surge of anger, his fists clenching at his sides. The sheer audacity of her denial after everything he had uncovered was almost too much to bear. But he forced himself to remain calm, his voice cold as he spoke again. "I have phone records, Sylvia. Text messages, meeting times, everything. Don't insult me by pretending it's not true." The words hung in the air, a damning verdict that left no room for evasion. Sylvia's resolve seemed to falter, and she looked away, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her secrets had finally crushed her. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. How long have you known?" "Long enough," he replied, his tone devoid of sympathy. "Long enough to know that this wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse. This was calculated. You were careful, weren't you? Making sure to keep each man separate, compartmentalized, so they'd never know about each other." Sylvia's silence was an admission in itself, and Lucas could see the guilt in her eyes, mixed with a flicker of defiance. She wasn't remorseful, at least not in the way he had hoped. Instead, she seemed more resentful that she had been caught, her pride wounded by the exposure of her deceit. "Why Sylvia?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "After all these years, after everything we've built together, why?" She looked away, her jaw clenched as she struggled to find the words. When she finally spoke, her tone was bitter, laced with frustration. "You wouldn't understand, Lucas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You were always so wrapped up in your work, in being the perfect sheriff, the town hero. But you were never here. You never saw me." The accusation stung, and Lucas felt a surge of anger rise within him. "So this is my fault," he replied, his voice growing louder. "You think that justifies betraying me, sneaking around with 3 different men?" Sylvia flinched at his words, her own anger flaring in response. "I didn't want to feel invisible, Lucas. I didn't want to feel like a trophy wife, sitting at home waiting for you to throw me a scrap of attention." Lucas fell silent, the words cutting him deeper than he cared to admit. For years he had poured himself into his work, believing that his role as sheriff was a noble calling, a duty that demanded sacrifice. He hadn't realized how much it had cost him on a personal level, how much distance it had created between him and the woman he loved. But that didn't excuse her actions. It didn't justify the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. "You had a choice, Sylvia," he said finally, his voice hard. "You could have talked to me, tried to make this work. But instead, you chose to destroy everything we built, piece by piece." The warning. The following day, Lucas returned to work with a storm brewing inside him. His confrontation with Sylvia had left him reeling, a mix of anger and heartbreak threatening to consume him. But he knew he had to stay focused. Sylvia's affairs were more than just a personal betrayal. They were a potential scandal that could jeopardize the integrity of the sheriff's department. Determined to maintain control over the situation, Lucas decided to issue a subtle warning to each of Sylvia's lovers. He wouldn't confront them directly, not yet. Instead, he would make sure they understood that he was aware of their betrayal, that they were on thin ice. Lucas started with Andra. The young deputy had grown noticeably uneasy around Lucas in recent weeks, and Lucas suspected that his suspicions were already weighing heavily on him. Lucas called him into his office under the pretense of discussing a case, but his questions were pointed, his tone laced with an underlying threat. "You've been doing good work, Andrew," Lucas began, his voice calm but cold. "But I need to know that my deputies are loyal, that they can be trusted, on and off the clock." Andrew swallowed, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Of course, Sheriff. I'm committed to this department." Lucas nodded, his gaze piercing. "I expect nothing less. Grantsville is a small town, Andrew. People talk, and I hear everything." Andrew's face paled, and Lucas could see the panic in his eyes. The message was clear, and Lucas felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that he had unsettled the young deputy. It was only a matter of time before Andrew cracked under the pressure. Next was Jordan. The dispatcher had always been quiet, reserved, but Lucas could sense a growing tension in him as well. Lucas made a point of stopping by his station, watching him with a keen eye. "Everything all right, Jordan?" Lucas asked, his voice deceptively casual. Jordan looked up, his expression wary. "Yes, Sheriff. Just handling the usual reports." Lucas nodded, his gaze lingering. "Good. I need my team focused, with no distractions." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Jordan's face betrayed a flicker of fear. He mumbled a quick response, his hand shaking slightly as he returned to his work. Finally, there was Malik. Unlike Andrew and Jordan, Malik was harder to rattle. His stoic demeanor remained unshaken, even under Lucas's intense scrutiny. But Lucas was determined to make his presence known, to remind Malik that he was watching. As Lucas passed him in the hallway, he paused, locking eyes with the patrol officer. "Keep your head in the game, Malik. There's no room for mistakes in this department." Malik's gaze was steady, but Lucas could sense a flicker of defiance. Malik wasn't intimidated easily, and Lucas knew that any confrontation with him would require more than veiled threats. But for now, the warning had been delivered. Sylvia's silence. Back at home, Sylvia remained distant, her interactions with Lucas strained and filled with tension. She had accepted the reality of her situation, but her defiance hadn't waned. Lucas could see the resentment in her eyes, the bitterness that had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. In the silence of their home, Lucas found himself consumed by the memories of their life together, the promises they had made, the dreams they had shared. It was difficult to reconcile the woman he had loved with the stranger she had become, a woman capable of such profound betrayal. But as much as he longed for answers, he knew that there were some wounds that time couldn't heal, some betrayals that left scars too deep to mend. Descent into darkness. The days following Lucas's confrontations with Sylvia and her lovers were tense and emotionally charged. The atmosphere in the Crane household had turned cold, each room echoing with unspoken accusations and a bitterness that seemed to cling to every corner. Sylvia moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding Lucas whenever possible, her eyes empty yet hardened, her defiance still simmering beneath a veneer of silence. For Lucas, each day felt like a test of his resolve. He went to work, fulfilled his duties, and maintained his composure, but beneath the surface, he was unraveling. The betrayal had hollowed him out, leaving him with nothing but the burning need for justice, or perhaps revenge. The lines between the two had started to blur in his mind, and he could feel himself sinking into a darkness he'd never known before. Gransville had always known Sheriff Lucas Crane as a man of integrity, a pillar of strength and moral authority. But now, with his personal life in shambles, he felt his grip on that identity slipping. Every time he looked into the mirror, he saw a man haunted by betrayal, his eyes filled with anger, his jaw clenched in a permanent scowl. The sheriff was no longer the man he had once been, and the people closest to him could see the change. The whispers began to circulate around town. People noticed the tension in his interactions with his wife, the cold stares exchanged between them at public events. Lucas was too sharp to ignore the subtle glances, the hesitant nods, the sympathetic smiles that seemed to linger a little too long. But he kept his head high, refusing to let anyone see how deeply his world had been shattered. As the days wore on, Lucas's anger continued to build, fueled by the quiet defiance in Sylvia's eyes every time they crossed paths. She seemed determined to stand her ground, to refuse him any satisfaction in the form of remorse. Instead, she held on to her pride, as if daring him to confront her again, to push her past the point of no return. It was in these moments, as he watched her move about their home with a cold, indifferent grace, that Lucas's thoughts turned dark. He began to envision scenarios that would make her feel the pain she had inflicted on him, fantasies of revenge that would strip away her composure, her pride, her very sense of control. But he knew that acting on these impulses would destroy him as well. He needed something more than just a fleeting moment of retribution. He needed to reclaim his dignity. The web tightens. Determined to gather even more evidence, Lucas intensified his surveillance on Andrew, Jordan, and Malik. His confrontations with each of them had only stoked his suspicion, and he knew that they were likely all involved in some capacity. But Lucas wanted to catch them in a way that would leave no room for denials or excuses. He wanted hard evidence that he could use to confront them and make them face the consequences of their betrayal. Lucas began by tailing Andrew, watching him from a distance as he went about his daily routine. He was careful to keep his presence hidden, tracking Andrew's movements with the skill of a seasoned investigator. He watched as Andrew left work, noting the places he frequented, the people he met. And then, one evening, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Andrew was standing outside a local cafe, looking around nervously as if waiting for someone. After a few moments, a familiar figure approached, Sylvia. Lucas watched from the shadows, his heart pounding as he saw his wife greet the young deputy with a soft smile, her hand lingering on his arm in a way that spoke of intimacy. The rage that surged through Lucas was almost unbearable. His fingers clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he fought the urge to confront them right then and there. But he forced himself to remain still, his mind working furiously as he took mental notes of every detail. He needed to stay calm, to gather enough evidence to confront them in a way that would leave no room for denials. The following day, Lucas set his sights on Jordan. He waited until after dark, following him as he left the sheriff's office and headed to a small, secluded bar on the outskirts of town. Lucas watched from a distance as Jordan entered, his demeanor tense and guarded. After a few minutes, Sylvia arrived, slipping into the bar and moving towards Jordan with a casual familiarity that made Lucas's stomach turn. They sat in a corner booth, talking quietly, their heads close together. Lucas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. The body language was enough. Jordan's hand rested on Sylvia's, his thumb brushing over her fingers in a gesture of comfort, or perhaps something more. Sylvia leaned in, her smile soft, her gaze warm, as if she had forgotten entirely about the man she had left at home. Each encounter felt like a stab to Lucas's heart, a reminder of the betrayal that had consumed his life. He felt like he was being torn apart, his identity as both a husband and a sheriff unraveling with each new piece of evidence. But he continued, determined to see this through to the bitter end. Finally, there was Malik. He was the most elusive of the three, his interactions with Sylvia sporadic and carefully concealed. Lucas had a harder time tracking him, but his patience eventually paid off. One evening, he spotted Malik entering a deserted park on the edge of town, his movements cautious and deliberate. Sylvia arrived shortly after, her face partially obscured by a scarf, her steps quick and furtive. They met beneath a street lamp, their voices low as they exchanged hurried words. Malik's expression was intense, his gaze piercing as he looked down at Sylvia. She seemed nervous, almost agitated, as if this meeting carried a weight that the others hadn't. Lucas watched from a distance, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece together the nature of their conversation. He couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. The tension in their body language, the way Malik's hand gripped Sylvia's arm as he spoke, it all told him enough. This wasn't just an affair. There was something darker, something that went beyond a simple betrayal, and Lucas was determined to uncover the full extent of it. Breaking point. The culmination of these discoveries pushed Lucas to the edge. He could no longer bear the weight of his suspicions, the constant surveillance, the endless web of deceit that had poisoned his life. He decided it was time to confront each of them, one by one, to force them to face the consequences of their actions. But he knew that he couldn't do it alone. Lucas reached out to an old friend from a neighboring county, a fellow lawman named Deputy Hank Lawson. Hank had always been a straight shooter, a man of integrity who valued loyalty above all else. Lucas knew he could trust him to help gather the evidence he needed to document the betrayal in a way that would hold up under scrutiny. Hank agreed to assist, his loyalty to Lucas evident in his willingness to get involved in such a sensitive matter. Together, they set up a plan to confront Andrew, Jordan, and Malik in a way that would leave no room for evasion. Lucas was tired of playing games, tired of hiding his pain behind a mask of stoicism. He was ready to take back control of his life, no matter the cost. The night of the confrontation arrived, and Lucas waited at the sheriff's office, his expression grim as he prepared to face the men who had betrayed him. Hank stood by his side, a silent but reassuring presence. Lucas's heart pounded as he waited for Andrew, Jordan, and Malik to arrive, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. When the three men finally entered the office, their expressions were wary, as if they sensed that something was wrong. Lucas wasted no time, his voice cold and steady as he addressed them. "Sit down," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're going to have a little conversation about loyalty." The three men exchanged nervous glances, their unease palpable. Lucas watched them with an intensity that bordered on feral, his gaze unyielding as he laid out the evidence he had gathered. He described each encounter in meticulous detail, his words sharp and precise, cutting through their defenses with the skill of a seasoned interrogator. Andrew was the first to break, his face pale as he stammered out a half-hearted apology, his eyes darting to Hank as if seeking an ally. But there was no sympathy to be found. Hank's expression remained impassive, his loyalty firmly with Lucas. Jordan tried to deny the accusations, his voice calm but his hand shaking as he insisted that it was all a misunderstanding. But Lucas's patience had worn thin, and he dismissed Jordan's excuses with a wave of his hand, his anger barely contained. Malik, however, remained silent, his expression unreadable as he listened to Lucas's accusations. There was a coldness in his gaze, a defiance that set him apart from the others. Lucas could see that Malik was not the type to back down easily, and he braced himself for a confrontation. "You think you can do this?" Malik finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can ruin our lives without facing the consequences?" Lucas met his gaze, his own voice deadly calm. "The only one who ruined anything here is you. You crossed a line, and now you're going to pay for it." The tension in the room was suffocating, a silent battle of wills that left no room for compromise. Lucas knew that this confrontation would not end cleanly, that the fallout would be messy and painful. But he was prepared to face whatever came next, to reclaim his life from the shadows of betrayal. The fallout. The confrontation in Sheriff Lucas Crane's office was only the beginning. The bitterness and resentment he unleashed that night sent ripples through the quiet town of Grantsville, a town that had once revered Lucas as its upstanding lawman. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a small town. Whispers of scandal followed Lucas wherever he went, casting long shadows over his once sterling reputation. The next morning, Lucas woke up in a house that no longer felt like home. The confrontation with Andra, Jordan, and Malik had been a turning point, and though he had exposed them, the victory felt hollow. He'd seen the fear and shame in Andra's face, the anger in Malik's eyes, and the desperate denial on Jordan's lips, but none of it had brought him any peace. The betrayal still clung to him, eating away at his insides like a poison that no amount of retribution could purge. Sylvia, who had overheard parts of the confrontation from down the hall, remained silent and withdrawn. She moved around the house like a stranger, avoiding Lucas and keeping to herself. He could see the guilt etched into her face, but there was no remorse in her eyes, only resentment and the faint glint of defiance. Her silence spoke volumes, a reminder that their marriage was now little more than a hollow shell. Despite his heartbreak, Lucas tried to focus on his duties. He was, after all, still the sheriff of Grantsville, and the town depended on him to uphold the law. But his mind was clouded, distracted by the weight of what he had uncovered. The very people he had trusted most had betrayed him, and the pain of it made him question everything he had once believed. A town divided. Grantsville was a close-knit community, and it didn't take long for rumors to spread. People began to talk, speculating about the cause of Lucas's sudden change in demeanor and the tension that had become apparent between him and his deputies. The town's loyalty was divided. Some sympathized with Lucas, whispering about the injustice he'd suffered at the hands of his wife and her lovers. Others took a more cynical view, questioning whether the sheriff's judgment had been compromised and whether he was still fit to lead. Lucas felt the weight of their judgment every time he stepped out of his house. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now averted their eyes, their expressions filled with pity or unease. It was as if they didn't know what to make of the man they had once trusted implicitly. Lucas had always been a private person, but now he found himself under a microscope, his every move scrutinized by the people he had sworn to protect. In the sheriff's department, the atmosphere was no better. Andra, Jordan, and Malik still showed up for their shifts, but the camaraderie that had once existed between them and Lucas was gone. They avoided him as much as possible, their conversations hushed and tense. Lucas could see the resentment simmering beneath the surface, especially in Malik's eyes. There was a sense of hostility, a quiet but palpable tension that left the entire department on edge. Hank, the deputy from a neighboring county who had helped Lucas gather evidence, visited him at the office one day, his face set in a worried frown. He had heard the rumors, and he could see the toll the situation was taking on his old friend. "Lucas," Hank said, his voice filled with concern, "you can't let this eat you alive. I know what they did was wrong, but don't let it ruin everything you've built. You're better than this." Lucas looked up from his desk, his eyes hollow. "Better? Hank, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Everywhere I look, I see betrayal. I can't even trust the men I work with, the people I thought were my friends." Hank placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression somber. "I know, Lucas, but holding on to this anger, it's only going to consume you. You've already exposed them. Maybe it's time to let it go, to start rebuilding." But Lucas couldn't bring himself to follow Hank's advice. The betrayal had left a scar too deep to heal, a wound that throbbed with every reminder of his shattered marriage and the deceit that had torn apart his life. Sylvia's descent. As the days passed, Sylvia's defiance turned into bitterness, and her resentment toward Lucas grew. She blamed him for the shame she now felt, the judgmental stares of the townspeople who whispered about her affairs. Though she had been the one to stray, she resented Lucas for exposing her, for dragging her secret life into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Sylvia began spending more time away from home, finding solace in the company of those who were willing to turn a blind eye to her actions. She found temporary comfort in people who didn't judge her, people who saw her as a victim of a broken marriage rather than the architect of her own downfall. One evening, Sylvia returned home later than usual, her face flushed and her eyes red. Lucas watched her as she stumbled through the doorway, the faint smell of alcohol clinging to her clothes. She met his gaze, her expression defiant, as if daring him to say something. "You're drunk," he said, his voice cold and devoid of sympathy. She scoffed, brushing past him. "What do you care? It's not like you ever paid attention to me before." Lucas felt his anger flare, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had grown tired of the endless arguments, the accusations, the venom that seemed to spill from her lips every time they spoke. But tonight, there was something different in her demeanor, something darker, more reckless. "You're destroying yourself, Sylvia," he said quietly. "Is that what you want?" She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with resentment. "Destroying myself? No, Lucas, you destroyed me. You humiliated me. You made sure the whole town saw me as nothing but a cheap affair." Her words cut deep, but Lucas held his ground. "You did that to yourself, Sylvia. I didn't force you into those relationships. I didn't make you betray me." Sylvia laughed bitterly, a hollow sound that echoed through the empty house. "Maybe I did, but you were never there. Lucas, you were always the sheriff, always the hero. But you were never my husband." With that, she turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Lucas standing alone in the silence, her words hanging heavy in the air. He felt a pang of guilt, a faint echo of the love they had once shared. But it was drowned out by the overwhelming sense of betrayal, the knowledge that no matter what he did, he could never go back to the life they once had. The breaking point. Lucas's life continued to spiral as the tension in his household and the sheriff's department reached a boiling point. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, a call came in. A domestic disturbance on the outskirts of town. Lucas knew he should let one of his deputies handle it, but he felt the need to get out of the office, to escape the suffocating walls that seemed to close in around him. He arrived at the scene to find a young couple arguing on the front porch, their voices raised, their faces contorted with anger. Lucas approached them calmly, his presence commanding as he diffused the situation with a few firm words. The couple quieted down, their anger subsiding as they realized the sheriff himself had come to intervene. As Lucas drove back to the station, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The couple's argument had reminded him of the fragility of human relationships, the thin line between love and hate, loyalty and betrayal. He had once believed that his marriage was unbreakable, that his commitment to Sylvia was as strong as his duty to the law. But now he saw how easily it could all come crashing down, how a single betrayal could unravel a lifetime of trust. When he returned to the station, he found Ander waiting for him in the parking lot, his expression tense. Lucas braced himself, sensing that this confrontation was long overdue. "Sheriff," Ander began, his voice wavering, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Lucas studied him, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Sorry doesn't change anything, Ander. You betrayed me. You betrayed this department. Andrew looked down, shame written across his face. "I know, Sheriff, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But please, I'm asking you to let me make it right, to let me keep my job." Lucas's jaw tightened, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He wanted to forgive Andrew, to give him a chance to redeem himself, but the pain of betrayal was too fresh, too raw. In that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't something he was ready to give. Not yet. Without a word, Lucas turned and walked past Andrew, leaving him standing alone in the parking lot, his plea unanswered. Sylvia's final act. In the days that followed, Sylvia's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She spent more time away from home, her absences stretching into the early hours of the morning. Lucas tried to ignore it, focusing on his work and attempting to rebuild his life, but he couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen, that Sylvia's descent was leading to an inevitable and tragic conclusion. One night, he awoke to the sound of shattering glass. He rushed downstairs to find Sylvia in the living room, surrounded by broken bottles and scattered belongings. Her eyes were wild, her face streaked with tears as she hurled another bottle against the wall, the glass exploding in a spray of shards. "Enough, Sylvia," Lucas shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "What are you doing?" She turned to him, her expression a mixture of anger and despair. "I don't know, Lucas. I don't know anymore. I'm just trying to feel something, anything, to fill this emptiness." He stepped towards her, his heart breaking at the sight of the woman he had once loved reduced to this. "Sylvia, please, let's stop this. Let's try to rebuild, to move on." But she shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "It's too late, Lucas. You destroyed any chance of that when you exposed me, when you humiliated me." She sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs as the reality of their shattered lives finally overwhelmed her. Lucas knelt beside her, feeling the flicker of the love he had once held for her, a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw only darkness, a void that no amount of forgiveness could fill. The final reckoning. The events of the last few weeks had left Sheriff Lucas Crane feeling like a stranger in his own life. The town of Grantsville, once a sanctuary, had become a cage of whispered rumors and judgmental glances. His own home had transformed into a battlefield of silence and shattered trust, with Sylvia's betrayal hanging over them, both like an inescapable storm cloud. Sylvia's breakdown in the living room had been a grim wake-up call for Lucas. The woman he had loved, the partner he had once thought he knew better than himself, was slipping away, lost in a spiral of self-loathing and bitterness. He couldn't deny that part of him wanted to help her, to save her from the darkness she had brought upon herself. But every time he looked at her, every time he remembered the depth of her betrayal, that desire was drowned by a tidal wave of anger and heartbreak. The days following Sylvia's breakdown were filled with a suffocating tension. She had stopped coming home most nights, and when she did, she moved around the house like a ghost, her eyes hollow, her spirit broken. Lucas wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to find out why she had chosen to tear their lives apart. But he knew there was no answer she could give that would satisfy him, no explanation that would make him whole again. One night, after another long and silent day, Lucas finally reached his breaking point. He found himself sitting alone in the darkened kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the empty chair across from him. He was tired of the lies, the secrets, the endless cycle of pain and resentment. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a loveless marriage with a woman he no longer trusted. With a heavy heart, Lucas made his decision. He would file for divorce. It was the only way to free himself from the torment that had consumed him, the only way to start anew. He could no longer hold onto a relationship that had already crumbled, nor could he allow Sylvia's presence to poison his life any further. The next morning, Lucas met with his lawyer, a stern but compassionate woman named Evelyn Grant. She listened intently as he explained the situation, her expression shifting from surprise to sympathy as he detailed the extent of Sylvia's betrayal. "You're doing the right thing, Lucas," Evelyn said, her voice gentle but firm. "Holding on to this marriage will only continue to hurt you. Ending it will allow you to begin healing." Lucas nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally taking control of his life, finally making a decision for himself instead of being at the mercy of Sylvia's lies. Confronting Sylvia. Later that evening, Lucas returned home, his mind steeled for the conversation that lay ahead. Sylvia was sitting in the living room, her gaze distant as she stared blankly at the wall. She looked up as he entered, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face as she met his eyes. "Lucas, what's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I spoke with a lawyer today, Sylvia. I filed for divorce." Sylvia's face paled, her expression shifting from shock to anger in an instant. "Divorce? So that's it then? You're just going to throw everything away?" Lucas's jaw tightened, his gaze unyielding. "I'm not the one who threw everything away, Sylvia. You made your choice when you betrayed me. You destroyed this marriage long before I ever considered ending it." She scoffed, her eyes narrowing as she rose to her feet, her posture defensive. "You think this is all my fault? You think I wanted this? I was lonely, Lucas. I was miserable, and you were never there. You're just as responsible for this as I am." Lucas felt his anger flare, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Maybe I wasn't perfect, Sylvia. Maybe I was too focused on my work, too wrapped up in my duty to this town. But that doesn't excuse what you did. You had a choice, and you chose to betray me. You chose to turn our home into a place of lies and secrets." Sylvia's defiance faltered, her eyes filling with tears as she looked away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I never wanted it to end like this. Lucas, I thought we could somehow find a way to fix things." "There's nothing left to fix," he replied, his voice cold. "The damage is done, Sylvia. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy between them. Sylvia's tears began to fall, her hands trembling as she covered her face. Lucas watched her, feeling a pang of pity mixed with a lingering bitterness. Part of him wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew that doing so would only prolong the inevitable. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. A town in turmoil. As Lucas prepared to move forward with the divorce, the news spread through Grantsville like wildfire. The town was abuzz with gossip, the scandal consuming every conversation in hushed whispers and knowing glances. People speculated about what had gone wrong, about the reasons behind the sheriff's sudden decision to end his marriage. Some sympathized with Lucas, seeing him as the wronged party, a man betrayed by the woman he had loved and trusted. Others took a more critical view, questioning whether Lucas's dedication to his job had driven Sylvia away, whether he bore some responsibility for the collapse of their marriage. The scandal didn't just affect Lucas's personal life. It seeped into his work as well. His authority was questioned, his judgment doubted, as people began to wonder if the sheriff they had once trusted was still capable of leading them. The betrayal had left him vulnerable, his reputation tarnished by the scandal that had rocked the town. Lucas could feel the strain wearing on him, the constant judgment and scrutiny weighing heavily on his shoulders. But he remained steadfast, determined to rebuild his life and regain the trust of the people who looked to him for guidance. Hank, his loyal friend, stood by him through it all, offering support and encouragement when Lucas needed it most. "You'll get through this, Lucas," Hank told him one evening over a quiet drink at the local bar. "People will talk, but they'll move on. Just stay true to yourself, and the rest will follow." Lucas nodded, grateful for his friend's unwavering support, but he knew that moving on would be easier said than done. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and he wasn't sure if he would ever fully recover from the pain Sylvia had inflicted on him. Sylvia's reckoning. In the days that followed, Sylvia found herself increasingly isolated. The people who had once admired her, who had respected her as the sheriff's wife and a prominent member of the community, now looked at her with disdain. Her reputation had been shattered, her carefully crafted image destroyed by her own actions. Even her friends had begun to distance themselves, unwilling to associate with a woman who had brought scandal to their town. The three men who had been her lovers, Andrew, Jordan, and Malik, had also withdrawn from her life, each one eager to avoid further entanglement in the drama she had created. She was left alone, forced to confront the consequences of her choices without the support of anyone who had once cared for her. One evening, Sylvia sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the silence of the empty house pressing down on her like a weight. She thought back to the life she had once shared with Lucas, the happiness they had known before everything had fallen apart. She had taken it all for granted, chasing after fleeting thrills and shallow connections, and now she was left with nothing. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, a bitter reminder of the price she had paid for her selfishness. She had destroyed her marriage, her reputation, and her sense of self, all in pursuit of something that had ultimately left her feeling hollow and unfulfilled. For the first time, Sylvia felt a flicker of true remorse, a deep and abiding regret that settled into her bones. She had hurt the man who had loved her, betrayed the vows they had made to each other, and now she was reaping the consequences of her actions. She could no longer hide from the truth. She had no one to blame but herself. Moving forward, the divorce was finalized in the weeks that followed, and Lucas found himself standing at a crossroads, uncertain of what the future held. He was free from Sylvia, free from the lies and betrayal that had plagued his life for so long. But the scars remained, a constant reminder of the pain he had endured. He threw himself into his work, focusing on his duties as sheriff and doing his best to restore the trust of the townspeople. He knew that regaining their faith would take time, that his reputation had been damaged by the scandal. But he was determined to rebuild, to prove that he was still the man they had once respected. With Hank's support, Lucas began to pick up the pieces of his life. He found solace in the simple things: a quiet evening at home, a walk through the town he had once loved, a conversation with an old friend. He was slowly rediscovering himself, learning to live without the weight of betrayal hanging over him. As for Sylvia, she left Grantsville shortly after the divorce was finalized, unable to bear the shame and isolation that had become her daily existence. She disappeared from the lives of the people she had once known, a ghost of the woman she had once been. Lucas never saw her again, and he found that he didn't miss her. In the end, the scandal that had nearly destroyed Lucas became a turning point in his life. It had tested his strength, his resilience, and his commitment to his principles. And though the journey had been painful, he emerged from it stronger, more determined than ever to live a life of honesty and integrity. The town of Grantsville eventually moved on, the whispers and rumors fading into memory. Lucas remained their sheriff, a man who had faced betrayal and come out the other side, scared but unbroken. He had endured the storm, and though he would carry the scars with him for the rest of his life, he knew that he was finally free.